Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and our topic this month is 1925, Rutland Goes to the Movies. It's a very different world a century ago because in Rutland we had two adjacent movie houses plus the Playhouse, which became the Paramount. And we'll begin our study with this ad, which we would find in the pages of the Rutland Herald. Thomas McKay was an entrepreneur from Nova Scotia who settled in Rutland, and he owned two theaters which were on 73 Wales Street. And we can see here that the simultaneous ad is that they would have pictures every afternoon at both theaters, 2:30, 6 o'clock, and 8:30 p.m. Here are a couple of ads that you would have seen in the pages of the Rutland Herald. And a little bit of background on these newspaper advertisements from my own experience. 50 years ago, I had a summer job as an errand boy for a theater. And in those days, before electronic communication, the theater manager would receive some of the graphics from the movie company. And then in turn, the theater manager would pencil in the times, the prices, etc. Once that was done, I would literally have to run 2 blocks to the local newspaper and then wait for the proof and then run it back to the theater. So here we have an earlier picture of 1925 with Mary Pickford in a costume drama called Dorothy Vernon of Haddon Hall. Some other ads here for the type of dramas that you could have seen, the dramas and the comedies that you could have seen in Rutland. We have a film called Locked Doors, a film called Painted Lady, which shows a quintessential flapper, another one called Miss Bluebeard, and then we have another one where we see the ad that goes with Miss Bluebeard, and it suggests that this is a bit of a risque movie. Some other ads, Gloria Swanson in Wages of Virtue. We have a film called Thy Name is Woman, and we have the further description of this one with the star Ramon Navarro, the great lover of the screen, fresh from his sensational triumph in a movie called Scaramucci. And then Tom Mix, who went on in Westerns for many, many years. We are going to be looking at clips from 6 films that people could have seen in Rutland in 1925. And the first is one with Mary Pickford called Little Annie Rooney. Mary Pickford was born in Toronto in 1892 as Gladys Smith. She was one of the early film pioneers of making several short movies a week in the early years of the 20th century. She became known as America's sweetheart for playing perennially young people. By the time the 20s wore on, people were a little dissatisfied and unable to accept that Mary Pickford was an aging woman. And she wrote this particular film script to show her, even though she was 33 years old, as a bit of a scamp, a person who was a girl of the streets in New York City in the early years of the 20th century. So let's look at some clips from Little Annie Rooney. Some of the people you just saw is that Mary Pickford, along with her husband Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin, were the founders of United Artists Studios. The music that you're hearing is a later addition to this, because at both the Strand and the Grand Theaters, you would have had an orchestra and a pianist providing the accompaniment to these films. So here is Mary Pickford, looking like she's a teenager. And one of the things that we can see here is that in this era where the actors did not speak, their emotions were probably much more exaggerated than you would have seen in later sound films. And many of the great actors of the silent era were not successful in their transition to talkies. Many silent films from this era have been lost. Probably more than 60 to 70% of films from this era have been lost. But with a resurgence of interest in silent movies, many of these films have been digitally remastered, as we can see here. The film was a great commercial success for Mary Pickford and ensured her popularity for a few more years. With the advent of sound, she retired from movies and spent a long period of time in her Hollywood mansion called Pickfair, and she was very reclusive. In 1976, the Motion Picture Association presented her with an honorary Academy Award, and they went to her house to present the award to her. And people of my grandmother's generation were rather saddened to see Mary Pickford as a frail old lady in her dressing gown receiving an Academy Award. The next film that we are going to look at is a good counterpoint to Mary Pickford, because it starred her then husband, Douglas Fairbanks. Douglas Fairbanks was another early film entrepreneur. He was known as the king of the swashbucklers. There's a difficult word to say, swashbucklers. He had appeared as Robin Hood and was in The Mark of Zorro, and he did all his own stunts. And in the movie The Thief of Baghdad, which he had a hand in writing, it's a very exotic and imaginative film about a thief who falls in love with the Caliph of Baghdad's daughter. And it's kind of an adaptation from the time or the era of Arabian Nights. And there were great feats of daring do in here, as we'll see. So Douglas Fairbanks in this film anticipated a lot of very athletic heroes, and a generation later Errol Flynn comes to mind, and then closer to our own time, Harrison Ford in some of the Indiana Jones movies. The music that you're hearing is from Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. It's a modern-day addition to the film. As we're seeing in this film, there was a great deal of sophistication in these films, and 1925 is the practical high point of the silent film era because talkies would be only 2 years away. The topic of this film reflects a 1920s fascination with the culture of the Middle East, and it's a very different interpretation than we would have seen in the modern era, because here it's very exotic, it's very alluring, it's very magical, it's not tainted with images of terrorism, which a lot of us kind of surmise today. Our next film is a mad caper comedy called 7 Chances with Buster Keaton. The premise of this movie is that the title character will inherit $7 million if he marries by 7 p.m. on his 27th birthday. Buster Keaton, who was not quite as popular as Charlie Chaplin, but he was a great comic actor, and he had a deadpan face. And this is one of the things that if we have Charlie Chaplin playing the tramp, Buster Keaton, as part of his comic effect and his mannerisms, is being very straight and serious. So here is a chase sequence from 7 Chances. He's being chased by all these women that he made false promises to marry. From a distance, you might think that this was Charlie Chaplin. The music that has been selected here, I think, is probably very close to the rolling piano music that you would have heard in the theater. Buster Keaton's popularity waned in the sound era, but he would come back to movies to make occasional cameos, and he would be featured in Sunset Boulevard, Around the World in 80 Days, made in 1956, and in the madcap comedy, It's a Mad, Mad World. One can only hope that these boulders were made out of something like paper mache. And you can see by the images of the clock reaching 10 minutes to 7, it would end happily. He would marry the one person whom he wanted to marry, and he would gain the $7 million that was promised to him. Our next film is something very different. It is The Big Parade, a movie about World War I, very different from the fantastic comedy movies. And this was surprisingly popular for a generation that was still in shock from the experience of World War I. And it features a very popular actor named John Gilbert, who is a wealthy man who enlists to be a soldier in World War I. He goes to France and he falls in love with a French girl, and they would be separated at the end of the war. And we will see a scene here from this movie near the end of the film when we see what happens to this World War I soldier. You can see with the opening credits, there was a big build-up to this film. And the fact that this film is showing some of the real horrors of World War I, it anticipates later movies about World War I, most notably All Quiet on the Western Front, which would be made 4 years later, and then closer to our own time, Paths of Glory. So here is John Gilbert, and you saw earlier his love interest, who was a French actress named Renée Adoré. She would have had a long career in film, most likely, but sadly she died as a young woman of tuberculosis. John Gilbert, one of the most sought-after male movie stars of the 1920s, did not successfully make the transition to talkies. There was a lot of rumors about what happened to him, but essentially his voice quality did not match what people perceived he would have sounded like in the transition to talkies. And he would be dead at the age of 38 from a heart attack. Our next film, one in a long array of remakes of this film, is the 1925 version of Phantom of the Opera. We all know the plot line of this one. What made this film especially memorable is the Phantom of the Opera was played by a character actor named Lon Chaney, who was a master of makeup and disguise, and he was called the Man of 1,000 Faces. And in some of his movies, like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, he did such contortions of his body that it rendered him with permanent damage. And again, he only lived to be 47 years old, died of pneumonia, but certainly some of the extents that he went to do his own stunts undoubtedly shortened his life. So this is probably the most famous clip from the movie that we're going to see of the unmasking of the Phantom. And when we see the unmasking and the job with which Lon Chaney did his makeup, it is said that people screamed and fainted in theaters when they saw the Phantom's face, which, if you know the story, had been disfigured by a fire. In the exaggerated emotions that we see in this scene, you almost don't need words to know what's happening. By contrast to the Broadway version of the show that we're familiar with, the Phantom's mask only covered half of his face. And our last film that we're going to be looking at was the most expensive movie made to date. It was the second screen version of the great religious classic written in 1880 by the Civil War general Lew Wallace. His complete title of the book was Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. But you can see in the movie posters, they really weren't playing up the religious imagery here. It's more of the romantic allure of this, which is probably not what Lew Wallace would have intended. So to make sense of the spectacular chariot scene that we are about to see, Judah Ben-Hur, a Jewish prince, inadvertently knocks a tile from his home on the head of a Roman official. He is sentenced to be a galley slave, which he serves for a number of years. He is taken under wing by a Roman senator, and in the end he adopts Judah Ben-Hur as his son. But the great villain, counterpart to Ben-Hur, is his former friend Messala, and they meet for a chariot race. And it's a pretty spectacular scene that we will end the film with. There were both casualties in this of the animals and the various stunts people. And this would be, again, reprised in the wonderful 1959 version of the movie with Charlton Heston and Stephen Boyd. So as we look at this spectacular chariot scene, it gives us an indication of the technological feats of this film. And even though it was a very, very popular movie, and many people went to see it, and it ran for several years, it cost MGM so much money that it was a it was a losing option in the long run. So Ramon Navarro was a Mexican actor whose name was changed from Ramon Samaniego, and he was the answer to Rudolph Valentino. He was very popular for a time in the 1920s, but he had a sad life in his later years. He came out sometimes to make occasional appearances in television shows, and I actually saw him in an episode of The Wild Wild West, and sadly he was murdered in his home. When we look at the thousands of extras that were employed for these scenes, that incidentally also included somewhere in the crowd Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, who knows where they are in here. You can see why this film was the most expensive film made to date. So while we're waiting for the race to begin, one element of the plot that I will share with you: when Ben-Hur was arrested, his mother Miriam and his sister Tirzah was arrested, and Ben-Hur was told that they had died in prison. But at the conclusion of the chariot race, when he and Messala have this conversation as Messala is dying, he reveals to Ben-Hur that his mother and his sister have not died, that they are still in prison. And the film ends with Judah Ben-Hur discovering that his mother and sister became lepers and were relegated to the Valley of the Lepers. But at the end of the movie, the women are cured by Jesus on his way to crucifixion, and Ben-Hur is restored to his home. But this is the scene that is most talked about in this film. Faithful to the story, you can see that Messala, the Roman foe here, is not very nice to Ben-Hur. We can see at the end here that Ben-Hur is victorious, and despite his evil machinations, Messala was trampled by horses. And I should add, an urban myth from the 1959 movie is that a man was killed in the course of the filming, and that is not true. So here we have Messala, who has an opportunity before he dies to confess to Ben-Hur what truly happened to his mother and sister. So I hope that you have enjoyed this opportunity with me to realize all the options that Rutland moviegoers had a century ago when they could have seen these films. Thank you for watching.